Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today, we're going deep into Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. It sparked a lot of conversation, and for good reason. It tackles a question. That's at the core of how our societies function. How is wealth distributed? What does that mean for things like fairness, opportunity, and even the future of capitalism?
Dense book, packed with centuries of data. But Piketty uses this historical perspective to look at modern-day anxieties about inequality. That's what makes it stand out.
Right from the start, Piketty argues that economists have spent too much time on simplistic growth models and not enough attention to wealth distribution, he says. We can't truly grasp capitalism without understanding wealth inequality. To do that, we need to look at the big long-term trends, not just the short-term ups and downs. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a powerful argument, backed by a massive amount of research. He introduces this idea called the first fundamental law of capitalism, represented by the formula M equals R IXOR. Might look intimidating, but it essentially explains the relationship between how much capital exists compared to a country's income, the rate of return on capital, and the share of capital in the overall income.
So how does this formula help us understand the real world?
Well, it reveals that wealth has the potential to grow much faster than income. If the return on capital consistently surpasses economic growth, which Piketty shows has happened a lot historically, then inherited wealth snowballs much faster than what people earn through work. This can lead to a concentration of wealth at the top, making inequality worse.
That's a crucial point. It ties into another idea that Piketty challenges, the Kuznets curve. Many economists used to believe that this curve showed inequality naturally decreases as countries get richer. But Piketty really pushes back on that.
He doesn't just push back. He calls it a Cold War myth. By meticulously analyzing historical data, Piketty shows that the Kuznets curve isn't a universal law. The period of decreasing inequality in the mid-20th century, which seemed to support the Kuznets curve, was largely influenced by the massive disruptions of world wars, not some inherent mechanism of economic development.
So are we to believe that wars and pandemics are the only things that can truly level the playing field? It's a pretty disturbing thought.
It's definitely a sobering observation. Makes you question the assumption that inequality automatically fixes itself with economic growth. This leads us to one of Piketty's biggest concerns, the trend toward what he calls patrimonial capitalism.
Can you explain what he means by that?
He's seeing a return to societies where inherited wealth plays a dominant role. The growing gap between the rate of return on capital and economic growth means that inherited wealth is expanding faster than earned income. It's like going back to the world of Jane Austen and Balzac, where your economic destiny was largely determined by what your family passed down.
And to illustrate this, Piketty actually uses literary examples, which is fascinating. He compares, for instance, the incomes of Jane Austen's characters to average wages in 19th century England.
He does, and it really brings those economic disparities to life. For example, characters in Austen's novels who earn £500 to £1,000 a year are considered well off. Piketty points out that this was more than 10 times the average income at the time. He also talks about Sir Thomas Bertram in Mansfield Park, whose investments in the West Indies play a big part in his wealth. It shows how capital was already crossing borders in search of higher returns, even back then.
So as Piketty saying, we're destined to repeat the extreme inequalities of the past, that we're headed back to the world of Pride and Prejudice. He's definitely raising a red flag, but he also emphasizes how government policies can have a massive impact on wealth distribution. He examines things like public debt, privatization, and how taxation has affected the accumulation of private capital throughout history. He even compares France and Britain, showing how their different approaches to public finances led to different levels of wealth concentration.
Okay, so just to recap, Piketty sees wealth inequality as a built-in feature of capitalism. He challenges the idea that economic growth automatically reduces inequality, and warns of this trend towards patrimonial capitalism, where inherited wealth takes center stage. However, he also highlights the role of governments in shaping these outcomes. So where to go from here? What does this mean for us? We'll get into those questions and explore Piketty's proposed solutions in the next part of our deep dive. We left off talking about how governments can influence wealth distribution. Does Piketty believe they should play a more active role in tackling inequality? Absolutely. He argues that the 20th century saw a significant shift in how governments intervene in the economy, especially when it comes to wealth redistribution.
And he has the data to prove it. He meticulously tracks how tax policies evolved over time, particularly the rise of progressive taxes on income and inheritance.
And exactly. He shows how the world wars, particularly World War I, forced governments to spend more and find new ways to raise revenue. This created the conditions for the modern welfare state with social insurance, public pensions, and wider access to education and healthcare.
It's fascinating how he connects these tax policies to the shifts in wealth distribution. He argues that progressive taxation played a big role in reducing inequality during the mid-20th century, particularly in countries like Britain and the United States.
Yes. He points to the period from the 1930s to the 1980s when top marginal tax rates were relatively high. This, he argues, helped to put a check on the concentration of wealth at the very top. But then things started to shift.
Right. The 1980s saw a move towards free markets, lower taxes, and what we know as Reaganomics and Thatcherism.
Precisely. Piketty documents how, starting in the 1980s, many countries began significantly lowering top tax rates, and this coincided with a resurgence of inequality, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world. He argues that this correlation is no coincidence.
So he's suggesting that lower taxes on the wealthy contribute to greater inequality, and that the higher taxes of the past actually help to reduce it. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is, and it's definitely sparked a lot of debate. But Piketty builds a compelling argument by weaving together economic theory, historical data, and insightful analysis of social and political trends.
So if he's not advocating for a return to the policies of the past, what's his prescription for the 21st century?
Piketty proposes a bold, and some might say radical, solution. A progressive global tax on capital.
A global tax? How would that even work in practice?
He acknowledges that it's a utopian ideal, but he argues that it's the most effective way to prevent an endless cycle of wealth concentration and bring capital under democratic control. He envisions a system where countries collaborate to track and tax wealth held anywhere in the world, with rates increasing based on the amount of capital held.
Oh, a massive idea. But even if you could get countries to agree on such a system, it seems pretty unlikely. Wouldn't the wealthy just find ways to hide their assets?
He anticipates that critique. He argues that a global financial cadastre, essentially a registry of who owns what assets, is crucial for making such a tax effective. This would require international cooperation and transparency in financial systems, which are notoriously opaque.
Okay, even I can see that this is a long shot.
Yeah.
But for the sake of argument, let's say we could implement a global wealth tax. What would be the benefits according to Piketty?
He believes it would generate significant revenue that could be used to fund public goods and services, reduce inequality, and invest in education and infrastructure. He also argues that it would promote fairness by ensuring that those who benefit most from the economic system contribute their fair share.
It definitely sounds like a way to address those long-term trends toward concentrated wealth that he's so concerned about. Are there any other potential upsides?
He sees it as a way to increase democratic oversight of the financial system, which he believes is essential for preventing excessive risk-taking.
So he's not just talking about raising revenue. He's talking about fundamentally reshaping the relationship between capital.labor and the state.
Absolutely. He believes a global wealth tax could help create a more equitable and sustainable form of capitalism, one less prone to crises, and more responsive to the needs of all citizens, not just the wealthy elite.
It's a thought-provoking vision, for sure. But realistically, how likely is it that such a system could ever be implemented? What are some of the practical challenges and political obstacles? We'll explore those questions and more. In the final part of our deep dive, we ended last time talking about a global wealth tax. How radical of an idea it is, let's be honest. A global system like that faces some major hurdles. Getting all those countries to agree, sharing financial information, it seems like an impossible task.
It would be a huge undertaking, for sure. You've got tax havens, concerns about privacy, the sheer complexity of how money moves around the world, not to mention the political will, or the lack thereof.
Hard to imagine convincing the wealthy and powerful to give up a chunk of their wealth, even if it's for the common good.
Piketty recognizes these challenges, but he believes we need to think bigger than the way things are. He sees a global wealth tax as a long-term goal, something to aim for.
So it's more about shifting the conversation, introducing a new way of thinking.
Exactly. He wants to challenge the assumption that we're stuck with wealth inequality, that there's nothing we can do.
And he does offer some more practical suggestions, even if they're not as sweeping as a global tax.
He does. He talks about the importance of financial transparency and regulation, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. He also thinks we should invest more in education and training so people can adapt to the changing economy.
So it's not just about redistributing wealth, it's also about helping people build wealth.
A key part of it. He emphasizes the need for a level playing field, where success is based on merit and hard work, not on what you inherit.
And he uses examples like Bill Gates and Lillian Bettencourt.
Powerful examples. Gates built Microsoft from scratch. Bettencourt inherited her wealth from L'Oreal, the company founded by her father. But their fortunes grew at similar rates. Highlights the inherent advantage of inherited capital, even in a system that claims to reward merit.
It really drives home Piketty's point that without specific policies, wealth tends to concentrate at the top, leading to wider inequality.
He's not just raising alarms, he's prompting us to act. He wants us to grapple with the complexities of wealth inequality and consider bold solutions, even if they seem difficult.
It's a call to examine our economic systems critically, to ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to build? Do we accept a world where a tiny elite controls most of the wealth? Or do we push for a fairer system with opportunities for everyone?
A question we all have to answer.
This deep dive has just scratched the surface of Piketty's work, if you're intrigued, and want to explore the dynamics of wealth and inequality further. I highly recommend reading Capital in the 21st Century. It's challenging, but incredibly rewarding, and it might just change how you see the world.
You can find a link to purchase the book in the episode description.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking deep dives like this one.